if you, like the rest of us, occasionally struggle with difficult emotions, things like anxiety or anger or shame, you have probably heard that it's important to process your emotions instead of just avoiding them. But what does it mean exactly to process our emotions? Today, I'm going to give you a really straightforward way to think about what emotional processing is and a simple but extremely effective 3-step method for processing any emotion in a healthy and effective way. Now, if you asked most therapists to explain what emotional processing means, you are probably in for an hour-long ramble about Freudian repression and inner child work and hidden trauma and all sorts of stuff like that. But actually, emotional processing is far simpler than any of that. Emotional processing just means listening to your emotions. All right, here's what I want you to do. Imagine a spectrum. On the far left edge of the spectrum, that's over here, this is avoidance. Now, avoidance is when your approach to difficult emotions is to deliberately ignore or pretend they're not there. This is a pretty unhealthy way of dealing with emotions because by deliberately ignoring them, you're teaching your brain to think of emotions as threats and dangerous, which makes sense if you think about it, because if your brain sees you like running away from an emotion anytime it comes up, it's going to assume, not surprisingly, that thing is dangerous or bad. If you do this enough and get in the habit of avoiding your emotions like this, your brain starts to generate serious anxiety about emotions, which leads to things like low confidence, insecurity, and emotional fragility generally. You just have a hard time dealing with difficult emotions. But on the far right-hand side of the spectrum, remember we had avoidance over here, now on the other edge is what we're going to call obsession. When your approach to dealing with difficult emotions is to impulsively try to fix or solve or analyze them or read meaning into them or get into an argument with them or criticize them or generally get lost in them in any kind of way, you're actually teaching your brain the same lesson as in avoidance because your brain interprets you trying to get rid of your emotions as fighting, and it similarly learns to see emotions as threats and dangerous. So, whether your reaction to emotions is fight or flight, either way, you get the same unhealthy outcome because you're teaching your brain that emotions are dangerous, which makes you more fragile and less resilient. Healthy emotional processing doesn't swing to either extreme. It stays relatively centered in the middle of the spectrum. Okay, it sits in between those two extremes, and it involves listening to your emotions and being aware of them without immediately reacting to them or trying to control them. When you allow your emotions to just be, your brain learns that they are safe. They're not threats. This is what leads to long-term confidence and resilience. And the good news here is that the vast majority of time, healthy emotional processing doesn't need to be some big, long, complicated, drawn-out process. Just because, you get a little angry when someone cuts you off on the freeway doesn't mean you need to book an emergency therapy session with your shrink, right? Or just because you feel a little bit sad or disappointed after your spouse gives you some feedback about the way you do dishes every night, that doesn't mean you need to go meditate for an hour or something. In fact, for like 95% of the emotions we experience throughout the day, a little annoyance here, a little bit of nervousness there, not doing anything is healthy processing because you are neither deliberately avoiding or obsessing over them. That said, sometimes those emotions can be particularly big or painful or even just kind of sticky, like we have a hard time shaking them. And when we get hit with these more difficult emotions, understandably, they're a little harder to deal with. You get that surge of defensiveness that can make it hard to continue to listen compassionately and empathetically as your spouse is trying to give you feedback. Or you feel that big wave of anxiety that can make it hard to share your creative idea at work in a meeting. Or you get hit with some grief as you are getting ready for bed, which then makes it hard to fall asleep and get good sleep throughout the night. Now, in situations like these, you might need to take a slightly more proactive approach to processing your emotions. This brings us to the AVA Method. Now, the AVA Method, it's a very simple emotional processing framework. I've developed it as part of my mood mastery program, and it's going to help you deal with any difficult emotion, anxiety, sadness, anger, resentment, disappointment, grief, whatever, in a healthy and effective way. AVA is an acronym, and it stands for the three main steps, which are acknowledge, validate, act. So what I'm going to do is I will briefly explain each of these three steps and give you a sense of how to use this framework to work through difficult emotions. So number one, acknowledge. Specifically, acknowledge your emotions clearly. One way I like to think about acknowledging our emotions is it's like interacting with other people at a party or a gathering. So imagine you walk into a cocktail party and you see someone you know. Now, if that's the case, you might say, "Oh, hey, Tom, great to see you." And then you go over there and you start up a conversation. Or you might just say, "Hey, Tom, nice to see you." You briefly shake hands and then you kind of go your separate ways. In both cases, whether you get into a discussion or you just kind of move on, you have at least acknowledged the other person. You use their name even. Similarly, when a difficult emotion comes up, it's very helpful to simply acknowledge the emotion and label it, even if you don't want to get into a conversation with it. So, for example, you might say something to yourself like, "Okay, I'm feeling pretty defensive right now." That's it. It took like 2 seconds. Or, "I'm feeling very nervous right now and a little bit sad." 3 seconds maybe? "I'm not totally sure what I'm feeling right now, but maybe it's something like guilt." At most, that was like 4 seconds. So this is very brief. Okay, this acknowledge step, super simple. You're just acknowledging and labeling whatever emotion you're experiencing. It seems simplistic, but taking a few seconds, again, to just identify and label how you think you might be feeling. You don't even have to get it right. Just trying to acknowledge that emotion. It's a critical first step for processing emotions in a healthy way because it shows your brain that you are approaching your emotions, not running away from them or trying to get rid of them, both of which lead to emotional fragility, as opposed to approach, which leads to emotional confidence long term. So that's the first step. The next step is to validate your emotions. Specifically, validate your emotions compassionately. After you have very briefly acknowledged how you're feeling, the next step is to take a moment to validate those feelings. Now, validation sounds like one of those annoyingly vague or complex bits of therapy jargon, but actually it's very straightforward. To validate an emotion, it just means to remind yourself that it is valid to feel that way, however uncomfortable it is. So, for example, something you might say to yourself to be validating would be, "You know what, this anxiety, it feels awful, but it's not surprising that I'm feeling like this, given what just happened to me." Or, "I hate feeling angry, but I know that feeling angry is not bad. It's acting on my anger that can be problematic." Another one might be sadness. "The sadness I feel, it's overwhelming, but I know it's a normal part of the grieving process." Another way to think about validation is that it's like giving yourself the same kind of support you would give to a friend who was struggling. So if your friend came to you and they said, "You know, I'm feeling really sad because of XYZ," you probably wouldn't start criticizing them, right, for feeling sad, or just ignore them after they said they were sad. No, you would probably be at least a little bit supportive. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that," or "Yeah, I've been through something similar. I know how tough that can be." Okay, it's really basic. It's just what you would do to someone else if they were struggling. So validation just means applying that same standard and process to yourself when you're having a hard time emotionally. All right, third and final step of the AVA method, act. Specifically, act on your values courageously. A lot of people have the misconception that emotional processing always involves some long, drawn-out process where you end up stewing and wallowing in your emotional pain. There are times when you need to do a little extended emotional processing and you need to, sit with a difficult feeling for a good amount of time, and that does happen occasionally, and you do need to be able to do that sometimes. But the vast majority of the time, healthy emotional processing means just very briefly acknowledging how you're feeling, validating it, and then getting on with your life. That's the key for this third and final step. Step 3, acting on your values courageously. It means that instead of trying to do something about your emotions, that's emotion-based action, you allow your emotions to be whatever they are, and then you do something that matters to you. That's values-based action. An example. Remember the example with the spouse giving you some feedback? So you get the tough feedback, you briefly acknowledge and validate your feelings of defensiveness, but then instead of analyzing, why you feel so defensive and criticizing yourself for feeling defensive, you just very briefly thank your spouse for being willing to give you this tough feedback because you really value honesty, especially in your relationship. Or let's go to the example of, you're in a meeting at work and you're feeling really anxious about sharing this new idea. So what do? You briefly acknowledge and validate your anxiety, but then you allow your anxiety to just be, and you share the idea anyway because you really value, creativity or teamwork or whatever value is pertinent to you in that context. And then our third example that we talked about before, you're lying in bed and you're feeling really sad as you're trying to fall asleep. So what do? You briefly acknowledge and validate the sadness. Then you are willing to just let it be there. You're willing to be sad. And you decide to, put on a podcast, right, to help you relax because you really value health. And a big part of health is getting good sleep each night, which you can't do if you're ruminating on your sadness. So remember, emotional processing, it is not about fixing or coping with your emotions. It's about listening to them and allowing them to be whatever they are as you get on with your life, living according to what matters most. All right, if you're interested in learning more about healthy emotional processing and using the AVA method in particular, I think you'll really enjoy Mood Mastery. This is my 4-week emotional resilience training program. Twice a year, I take a handful of students through a live 4-week program where we go through all sorts of topics like emotional intelligence and how to be aware and in tune with your emotions and looking at negative self-talk and limiting beliefs and values, acting on our values, all the kind of basic ingredients that are required for staying emotionally strong and resilient in the face of difficult emotions. So if that sounds like something you might enjoy, I'd encourage you to check out that program. I'll put a link to it in the notes. And then I have a few other resources for you that might be helpful. The first is what I call my Values Discovery Toolkit. And this is, the third step in the AVA method, acting on your values courageously. That's a lot easier to do if you actually know what your values are, which we should not take for granted, because if we haven't spent time discovering and meditating and reflecting on our values, how are we going to know what they are? So this little PDF guide, it's 4 or 5 pages long. It walks you through a few of my favorite exercises for actually discovering what your personal values are. So check that out. There is a link below. And then I have 2 articles that I will point you to that I think will also be really helpful. One is called 3 Habits That Will Make You Emotionally Strong. And the other one is called A Brief Guide to Emotional Resilience. And then the last thing I'll say before I let you go is that if you enjoyed this video, I have another one I think you will really like. It's called 3 Ways to Stop Bad Moods. And you can watch it right here.